3 weeks before I planned to tell my son I was in love again, I walked into Mercy General for a routine cardiology appointment, and a woman I barely recognized saved my life. I want you to stay with me through this. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. I love knowing how far these stories reach. And just so you know, some details in this story have been changed to protect those involved. Just everything that matters is true. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I live in a pale blue colonial on Birchwood Lane in Fairhaven, Ohio, the same house my husband Robert and I bought in 1989 when our son was still in diapers. I taught high school English for 31 years and served as principal of Fairhaven Academy for 12 of those. Robert died of pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. We had 41 years together, good years, hard years, hours. After Robert died, I did what women like me do. I kept moving. I kept the house clean, the garden alive, the book club going every third Thursday. I visited my son and his wife for holidays. I smiled at the right moments. I let people say he'd be so proud of you without correcting them. I was fine, mostly, which is different from being okay. And then, 8 months ago, my neighbor Harold knocked on my door to return a casserole dish and stayed for 3 hours. We talked about Robert and his late wife, Ellen. We talked about our adult children and their impossible schedules. We talked about whether it was too late to learn to kayak. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in 6 years. The kind of laugh that surprises you, the kind that comes up from somewhere you thought had gone quiet. We had been seeing each other quietly ever since. I hadn't told my son yet. I was building up to it. I kept waiting for the right moment, the right words. My son is protective. He loved his father deeply. I knew it would be complicated. What I didn't know was how much he already knew. The morning of my appointment, I drove myself to Mercy General the way I always did. Doctor, Ellison had been monitoring a slight irregularity in my heartbeat for 2 years, nothing serious, just something to watch. I signed in at the desk, sat down in the waiting area with a magazine I didn't read, and waited for my name. A woman appeared in the hallway. Scrubs, gray-streaked hair pulled back mid-60s. She looked at me for a moment, then something crossed her face, a flicker of recognition followed immediately by something else, something tight and urgent. She walked toward me and crouched down beside my chair. "Mrs. Calloway?" she whispered. I looked at her. "Yes, I'm Carol Hines. I was on the oncology floor when your husband was here. I don't expect you to remember me." She paused. "I need you to come with me right now. Please don't ask questions until we're somewhere private." I remember thinking, this woman is afraid, not of me, of something she knows. I stood up and followed her. She took me down a side hallway I'd never noticed, past a linen closet and a staff break room, and stopped in front of a door marked Consultation B. She unlocked it with a badge, pulled me inside, and closed it without turning on the light. "They're in the hallway?" she whispered. "Just outside Dr. Ellison's office. Please, just listen." Voices, muffled by drywall and distance, but close enough. I knew the first voice immediately. The careful, measured cadence of it, the way he lowered his register when he was being serious. "My son, she won't fight it," he was saying. "She trusts him completely. That's the point." A woman's voice next, higher, precise. "My daughter-in-law, the assessment needs to be filed by Friday. That's the window. After Friday, the property transfer takes longer to contest." A third voice. Male, professional, someone I didn't know. "Mild cognitive impairment is well within my scope to document. I've reviewed the materials you sent. Her age, the grief, history, the new relationship, all of it reads as a pattern of declining judgment. It's defensible." My daughter-in-law again. "And the trust? The Birchwood property? Once the guardianship petition is approved, all assets fall under conservatorship. If Nathan is named conservator, which is standard for an adult child, he has full authority to liquidate or transfer." Carol's hand found mine in the dark. She was trembling. I wasn't trembling. I was very, very still. My son spoke again. "And she can't contest it?" "She can try. But with the assessment on record and no other family to support her claim, it becomes difficult. Especially if she's already showing, as you described, signs of poor judgment. Poor judgment. I turned that phrase over in my mind. New relationship. Harold. They were calling Harold evidence of my deterioration. I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, quieter now, moving away. The appointment today buys us time. She won't know anything until Friday. Friday. 3 days from now. Carol waited until the hallway went silent. Then she turned on the light. Her eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I've been on this floor for 22 years. I've seen things. I know what this looks like, and I couldn't just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Your husband was a good man. I held his hand when you stepped out once to get coffee. He talked about you. I couldn't let this happen." I looked at this woman who had carried a dying man's words for 6 years and brought them to me in a consultation room because it was the right thing to do. "The man they were speaking to," I said. "Who is he?" "Dr. Warren Hayes. He's a consulting psychiatrist. He isn't on staff here permanently. He comes in for specific assessments." She hesitated. "He's been used before. Mrs. Calloway. In cases like this, I've seen his name on paperwork that didn't sit right. If you're still here with me, I want to ask you something. If you overheard your own child planning to take everything you had built, everything your late husband died believing was protected, what would you do in that moment? Stay and confront them? Leave and pretend you never heard? Tell me in the comments. I want to know." I drove home on autopilot. I don't remember the route. I remember pulling into the driveway and sitting with my hands on the steering wheel for a long time, staring at the front of the house. The blue paint we'd chosen together. The window boxes Robert built the summer before his diagnosis. The oak tree in the side yard that our son used to climb when he was 7. I thought about my son at 7. The way he'd come inside with bark on his palms and ask me to make grilled cheese. The way he'd crawl into our bed during thunderstorms until he was too old to admit it. The way he'd cried at his father's funeral, not quietly, not with dignity, but with everything he had, doubled over in the front pew. I thought about my daughter-in-law and the word that best described her. Efficient. Not warm, not unkind, just efficient. She had married my son 11 years ago. She ran their household the way a CEO runs a quarterly review. I had never fully relaxed around her, which I'd always assumed said more about me than her. I was beginning to revise that assumption. I went inside, made tea I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table with my phone. I called Linda Patterson first. She'd been my personal attorney for 15 years. Corporate contracts mostly I'd used her to finalize Robert's estate. Tonight, I needed something different. She answered on the second ring. "Linda," I said, "I need to see you tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." Her office was on 5th and Monroe, a modest suite above a dry cleaning shop that she'd occupied for as long as I'd known her. She met me at the door, one look at my face, and poured us both coffee without asking. I told her everything. The consultation room, Carol's hand in the dark, the voices through the wall, Friday's deadline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her cup. "Guardianship petitions based on cognitive decline are more common than people think," she said, "especially when there's an estate involved and a new relationship that someone finds threatening." She looked at me carefully. "How long has Harold been in the picture?" 8 months. "And Nathan doesn't approve." "He doesn't know. Not officially. But I think he suspects." Linda pulled out a legal pad. "The property Birchwood Lane. It's in your name alone?" "Yes." Robert's estate transferred everything to me. The house, the Morrison Calloway Family Trust, roughly $900,000 in total assets. The house alone is worth $400. Linda wrote something down. "We need to move on 3 fronts before Friday. First, an independent cognitive evaluation, someone completely outside Nathan's orbit. Second, an emergency protective order to freeze any pending conservatorship filings. Third, we need to know what Dr. Warren Hayes has done before." She tapped her pen. "For that last one, I have someone." She slid a business card across the table. "Frank DeLuca, Private Investigations, former Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Department." "He's thorough," Linda said. "And he's quiet." I picked up the card. It was plain. Just a name, a number, an address in Cleveland. "Linda," I said, "my son is involved in this." She met my eyes. "I know. I need to understand how much. Whether he's the one driving it or whether I stopped. I need to know." She nodded slowly. Then, you need Frank. I called him from my car. He answered immediately, which I took as a good sign. His voice was direct without being cold. I told him what I knew. He asked 3 questions. The doctor's full name, the name of any entity or holding I thought might be connected, and whether I had anything in writing. Nothing in writing, I told him. Just what I heard. That's enough to start, he said. Give me 24 hours. I drove home in the dark. The house felt different when I walked in, not dangerous, just altered, the way a familiar room looks strange after you've been away. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the framed photos on the refrigerator. My son at his college graduation. The 2 of us at Niagara Falls the summer Robert got sick, before we knew. His wedding photo, arm around his bride, both of them squinting into the sun. I remembered who I was in each of those photographs. I was someone who believed she was loved without conditions. 72 hours. That was all I had. The next morning, I called Dr. Priya Mehta at Cleveland Clinic. She was a neurologist I'd read about 2 years earlier in a profile in Ohio Magazine, a specialist in elder cognitive health who was also, as the article noted, an advocate against fraudulent guardianship practices. Her office was booked out 6 weeks, but her assistant put me through when I explained the circumstances. We had a phone consultation within the hour and an in-person assessment scheduled for the following morning. At noon, my phone buzzed. Frank DeLuca. He asked if he could come to the house at 2 o'clock. He arrived exactly on time. 60 years old, heavy-set, gray, close-cropped hair. He carried a manila folder, and he set it on my kitchen table without preamble. Start with this, he said. I opened it. The first page was a property record. A second mortgage filed against my son's home in Westfield, filed 14 months ago, approximately $380,000. The cosigner on the loan was listed as Margaret Ann Calloway. I stared at the page. I never signed this. I know, Frank said. The signature on file is forged. I've already had a handwriting analyst take a preliminary look. He paused. He needed the money. Mrs. Calloway. His architecture firm has been losing clients since 2022. He's behind on the mortgage, behind on a business line of credit. Total exposure is close to $600,000. I closed my eyes for a moment. He used my name, I said. Yes. Frank's voice was even. Careful. Not unkind. The second folder. I opened it. Bank statements. A series of transfers I didn't recognize from an LLC called Callaway Asset Management, formed in Delaware 8 months ago. The sole registered agent was my daughter-in-law. Frank leaned forward. The LLC was formed the same month Harold came into the picture. Your daughter-in-law filed it, not your son. He let that sit. Your son's name isn't on the filing. I looked up. There's a version of this, Frank said carefully, where your son knows everything. And there's a version where he's been told just enough to believe he's protecting you. He folded his hands. I don't know yet which version is true, but I think you should consider the possibility that the person driving this isn't who you think it is. I thought about my daughter-in-law's voice in that hallway, precise, efficient, about the way she had said the assessment needs to be filed by Friday, not we need or he suggested, but a flat, logistical need, the way you talk about a tax deadline. I thought about the look on my son's face at Robert's funeral, the way he had held my hand outside the church and said, I'll always take care of you, Mom, and how I had believed him completely. The third folder, I said. Frank set it down. Dr. Warren Hayes. This is what Carol Hines remembered correctly. He spread out 3 printed documents. A 2019. A 74-year-old woman in Akron. Hayes filed a cognitive impairment assessment. Her nephew was appointed conservator. The family home and investment accounts combined value just under $800,000 were liquidated within 6 months. She was placed in a memory care facility. She died the following year. He paused. Hayes received a consulting fee of $60,000. I felt cold. Lianxianling Archiyi, a 79-year-old man in Columbus. Same pattern. Hayes's assessment. Daughter appointed conservator. Assets transferred. He died in assisted living in 2022. Hayes received $55,000. I made myself look at the third document. 2023. A 68-year-old woman in Cincinnati. Her name was Diane Hobart. Hayes filed the assessment. But her son-in-law, who was an attorney, noticed the irregularities in time. He filed an injunction. The conservatorship petition was withdrawn. Hayes was never charged. Frank looked at me. Diane Hobart is alive and she is willing to speak to you. I stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the oak tree stood in the late October light, leaves gone mostly gold. Robert had planted it the year our son was born. He'd said, "Every boy needs a tree." $900,000. My husband's life's work. The house we'd chosen together, the trust we'd built carefully, the future I had assumed was simply mine. I turned back. "I need all of this documented and ready by Thursday evening," I said. Frank nodded. "It will be. And Diane Hobart, can she join us by phone?" "She's already agreed." I looked at him. "Why are you helping me this quickly?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother went through something similar. Different circumstances, different people. She lost her house. She didn't get it back." He picked up his folder. "I don't like losing twice." That night I sat in Robert's old armchair with the lights low and thought about what I was going to do. Not how to stop it, I knew how to stop it, but what I was going to do about my son. I could have called him. I could have gone to his house and sat down across the table and said, "I know. Tell me how much of this was you. Tell me how much of this was her. Let's figure out what's left." I could have died quietly, privately, without witnesses. But I thought about the two people in Akron and Columbus who hadn't had a Carol Hines, hadn't had a Frank DeLuca, hadn't had anyone pull them into a consultation room in time. I thought about Diane Hobart in Cincinnati and the son-in-law who had noticed the irregularities, and I thought, someone has to make noise. Thursday evening, I sent a text to my son. "Family dinner, Friday at 6. I want to talk about some things before the holidays. Bring Brianna." He replied within minutes. "Of course, Mom. We'll be there." Linda Patterson sat in the living room when they arrived. Frank DeLuca stood near the kitchen doorway. Harold, because I had called Harold on Wednesday and told him everything and he had driven over and sat with me while I cried for the first time since the consultation room, Harold sat in the armchair in the corner, quiet and present. Carol Hines had come at my request. She sat on the sofa, hands folded in her lap. My son walked in and saw the room and stopped. My daughter-in-law was a step behind him. She saw Linda first, then Frank. Her face rearranged itself into something careful and composed, and I watched her do it, and I thought, there she is. There's the person I've been trying to understand for 11 years. "Mom," my son said, "what is this?" "Sit down," I said. "Both of you." They sat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pace or gesture. I stood in the center of my living room in the house Robert and I had bought together, and I spoke the way I had spoken for 31 years in front of students who needed to understand something important. "On Monday morning," I said, "I was at Mercy General for a routine appointment. I was taken into a private room by a nurse who remembered your father and cared enough to find me." I nodded toward Carol. From that room, I heard a conversation in the hallway outside Dr. Ellison's office. My son's face had gone still. "I heard your voice," I said. "I heard your wife's voice. And I heard Dr. Warren Hayes." My daughter-in-law said nothing. She had gone somewhere behind her own eyes. "Nathan," I said, and I used his name the way I used to when he was young and had done something I needed him to account for, not angry, just clear. "I need you to tell me how much of this you understood." He opened his mouth, closed it. "The second mortgage on your house," I said. "In my name." "Did you know?" A long silence. His jaw worked. "Did you sign my name, Nathan? Or did someone tell you it had already been handled?" He looked at his wife. Just briefly. Just a flicker. But I had been a high school principal for 12 years. I knew how to read a room. She said nothing. He looked back at me. "She told me you'd agreed," he said. His voice was very quiet. "She said you'd co-signed willingly and you didn't want to make it a whole conversation. I let that sit in the air." "I never signed anything," I said. "Not for you. Not for the LLC your wife filed in Delaware. Not for Dr. Hayes. Nothing." I paused. "You were going to stand in front of a judge on Friday and tell him your mother was losing her mind and you had no idea the signature on that mortgage was forged." He looked at his wife, and this time he didn't look away. Something was changing in his face. the careful blankness of someone who had been performing a role and was now watching the role dissolve. "Nathan," I said, "I am not losing my mind. I am not confused or impaired or declining. I am 67 years old, and I am sharp, and I am in love with my neighbor, and I have every right to be." Harold sat very still in the corner. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. My daughter-in-law spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled. "Margaret, I understand how this looks. Let me show you what it looks like," I said. Linda stood and pressed a key on the laptop she'd set up on the sideboard. The screen filled with the property record, the forged signature, the LLC, the bank statements, the dates. Frank DeLuca spoke from the doorway. He was brief and precise. He laid out the financial picture, the second mortgage, the business debts, Callaway Asset Management, the timeline. Then he opened the third document, Dr. Warren Hayes. 3 names, 3 assessments. 2 people who did not survive their conservatorships. My son was no longer looking at his wife. He was looking at his hands. The screen changed. Diane Hobart appeared 69 years old, silver-haired, sitting in a well-lit room somewhere in Cincinnati. She had agreed to appear by video link, and she looked directly into the camera the way people do when they have decided they are no longer afraid. "My name is Diane Hobart," she said. "In 2023, Doctor, Warren Hayes told my family I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. He filed a report. The process to take my home had already begun before I knew about it." She paused. "I was lucky. My son-in-law caught it in time. But the people before me were not lucky." She looked at the camera. "Please don't be the next person who wasn't lucky. And please don't let someone you love be the one who caused it." The screen went dark. The room was silent, except for the sound of my son breathing. My daughter-in-law stood up. "I'd like to speak to an attorney." "That's your right," Linda said. "You should know that an emergency protective order was filed and granted this afternoon. Any conservatorship petition filed before Monday will be automatically suspended pending review. And the signature on the second mortgage has been referred to the Fairhaven County Prosecutor's Office." My daughter-in-law said nothing else. She walked to the front door, opened it, and left. My son didn't move. I crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside him, the way I used to sit beside him when he was sick as a child, close enough that he could feel me there. "I didn't know about the signature," he said. He wasn't crying yet, but his voice was carrying more weight than it could hold for much longer. "She told me the cosign was verbal. She told me you understood. She said you'd said it was fine." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "I knew things were bad with the business. She said this was the solution. She said it would just be temporary, that we'd pay it back before you even noticed." "And the doctor?" I asked. "Dr. Hayes?" A long pause. "She said it was a precaution, that Harold was that he might be after your money, that you seemed confused about things, that we were just being careful, protective." He dropped his hands. His face looked like someone had removed something essential from it. "I believed her, Mom. I wanted to believe her because I was scared, and I was ashamed about the money, and I didn't want to tell you the business was failing because he stopped. Because Dad would have known how to fix it, and I don't, and I couldn't stand to tell you that. I thought about a boy with bark on his palms asking for grilled cheese. I thought about Robert in that hospital bed, talking to a nurse whose name I didn't know, saying things I would only find out 6 years later. "Nathan," I said, "your father knew the difference between failure and being finished. He would have sat with you and he would have worked through it, and I would have too. If you had come to me—" He broke then. Not loudly, just the way grown men cry when they've been holding it for too long, shoulders curling forward, face turned away. I put my hand on his back and left it there. Later that night, after Frank and Linda had gone, after Carol had hugged me at the door and said Robert would be so proud, after Harold had made tea and then quietly left to give us space, my son and I sat at the kitchen table. He told me everything he knew, which was not everything his wife had known. He told me about the business 3 years of slow hemorrhaging, contracts falling through, a recession in commercial construction that had hit smaller firms hard. He told me about the loan, how she had handled it, how he had told himself she was more capable with finances and he should trust her judgment. He told me about the gradual accumulation of small decisions he had made by not deciding, by letting her arrange things, by looking away from details he hadn't wanted to examine. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "You understand this is not something I can simply forgive and move past. What was done, even if you didn't fully understand it, put me in serious danger." He nodded. He didn't argue. "You used my name," I said. "Even if you believed it was consensual, you used my name without confirming it with me directly. That is a line." "I know. I need you to deal with the business honestly. With an accountant, with a restructuring attorney, with real numbers, not with someone else's assets." "I know. And I need some time," I said. "I don't know how much, but I can't pretend this week didn't happen." He looked at the table. "I don't expect you to." He left around 11. I watched his headlights back out of the driveway. I stood at the front door for a long moment, and then I walked into Robert's old study and sat in the chair behind his desk. I looked at his photograph, the one from 1995, the year we moved in. He was standing in the front yard, squinting into the sun, one hand shading his eyes, the other pointing at something off camera. I never knew what he was pointing at. I'd asked him once and he'd said, "The future. Probably." I kept my promise, I thought. I didn't let them take it, but I almost did. And that was the part that sat with me in the quiet, not what they had planned, but what had made it possible. The years my son had felt unable to come to me, the distance I hadn't noticed growing, the fact that when his life was falling apart, his first instinct had not been to call his mother, and maybe that said something I needed to sit with. In the weeks that followed, the legal picture clarified. The conservatorship petition was never filed. Linda had moved fast enough that it never reached a judge. The forged signature on the second mortgage became a criminal matter, and my daughter-in-law retained an attorney of her own. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of her involvement and the degree of my son's blind compliance, and the courts would eventually sort out what each of those things meant under Ohio law. Dr. Warren Hayes' medical license was under review by the Ohio State Medical Board by November. Diane Hobart's attorney connected with Linda, and the cases of the two people who had not survived their conservatorships were being reopened by their families with new information. 3 other patients came forward after local news coverage. Hayes resigned from his consulting position before he was formally asked to leave. My son and his wife separated in November. He moved into a rented apartment in Fairhaven. He started working with a financial advisor and a therapist. He texted me every few days, brief, careful messages. Weather, work, small things. I replied. It wasn't much, but it was something. Harold and I had our first real date in December. Dinner at a place downtown that Robert and I had never gone to, which felt important somehow. We talked about what the fall had been like. We talked about his daughter in Portland and my son and the oak tree and what it meant to try again after you'd already had the real thing. He didn't pretend it was simple, neither did I. That mattered to me more than I expected. In January, I sat in Dr. Mehta's office to review the results of the independent cognitive evaluation she had conducted in October. Her report was 13 pages. I had brought Linda with me, but I didn't need her. Dr. Mehta set the folder on her desk. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "your memory, executive function, reasoning, and verbal acuity are all in the exceptional range for your age group. Frankly, they're exceptional for any age group." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "There is no basis, current or historical, for any claim of cognitive decline." I had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something quieter, like setting down a bag you'd been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it was heavy. In February, my son sent me a letter. 6 pages, handwritten. He talked about his father, about the years after the funeral, about the way grief had made him simultaneously more protective of me and less able to be present with me, how those two things had lived together in him without his understanding the contradiction. He wrote about his wife, about how she had become the person who handled difficult realities so he didn't have to, and how he had let that arrangement persist until he was almost someone he didn't recognize. He wrote about how ashamed he was, not just about the mortgage, not just about the doctor, but about the version of himself he had become through 100 smaller choices he had made over years. One passage I've read more than once since then. he wrote. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was afraid to face you because facing you meant facing everything I wasn't. I made you smaller in my mind so I could feel bigger. And I will spend a long time making that right, if you'll let me. I sat with the letter for 2 days before I responded. I wrote back 4 pages. I told him about Robert talking to Carol in the hospital room. I told him his father would have been devastated by this year and would also eventually have understood it because Robert had known the difference between who someone was in their worst moment and who they were capable of becoming. I told him I forgave him for the things that were his to be forgiven for, and that the rest was between him and the law and his own conscience. I told him I was proud of who he had been before this. I told him I believed that person was still there. And I told him that when he was ready, truly ready, not performing readiness but actually inhabiting it, I would make grilled cheese and he could tell me about the tree. On a Thursday in March, 8 months after a nurse pulled me into a dark room and saved everything I had, I drove to a coffee shop on 5th Street and parked in the same spot where I had parked the night I called Frank DeLuca. My son was already there when I walked in. He was at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug, wearing the gray sweater Robert used to borrow. He looked up when I came through the door. He stood. I crossed the room and he hugged me the way he used to when he was young, the way you hug someone when you're not performing an emotion but simply having it. I held on longer than I expected to. We ordered coffee. We sat for 2 hours. He told me about the apartment, about therapy, about a small project he'd landed, just a kitchen renovation, nothing significant, but something. He asked about Harold. I told him we were taking it slowly and it was good. He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, which was its own kind of progress. When we were leaving, he held the door for me. We stood on the sidewalk in the March cold. Mom, he said, I'm sorry for all of it. I looked at my son, this man who had my husband's jaw and my father's stubbornness and his own complicated, striving heart, and I thought about all the things I could say. I know, I said. Keep going. He nodded. We walked to our separate cars. I sat in mine for a minute before I started the engine. I watched him pull out of the lot. I thought about Birchwood Lane and the blue paint and the window boxes and the oak tree. I thought about Carol Hines and a dark room and a hand finding mine. I thought about all the people who hadn't been that lucky. If this story stayed with you at all, if it made you think about someone you love, about trust, about the things we assume are safe, I'd ask you to share it. Because what almost happened to me happens to people every day, quietly, in houses on ordinary streets in ordinary towns, and most of them don't have a Carol Hines. Don't wait for a crisis to check on the people in your life who are aging alone. Don't assume they're fine because they say they are. And don't let love of any kind, grief, loyalty, fear, make you look away from what's right in front of you. I got my second chance on a sidewalk in March. I plan to use it. Thank you for walking all the way through this with me. I'd love to know in the comments, at what moment would you have stopped trusting? And what would you have done differently? I'm genuinely asking. These stories mean more to me when you're in them too.